how's it going, everybody? We're going to be kind of in a way reviewing the G4, just going over our findings for everything. And then also talking about the calibration of it, which is a little bit different than the previous LGs. Yeah, just some things that we found. So how's it going, DeWayne?
Good. How's it going with you?
Not bad. So I know before you had said you were going using Dwayne Davis now, but your title here says D Nice, so I didn't put D Nice in the title of the stream.
It's fine. I just figured because so many people from the forum will be watching your stream, I just rather just use the D Nice. It's what they know on ABS, of course. So
Okay.
call me Dwayne, D Nice. It doesn't really matter.
All right. So at this point, about how many G4s have you seen?
Ooh, probably 20-ish or so.
Okay.
We got a couple. Actually, I have a few more coming up this week. But for me, they've all been pretty consistent in how they come out calibration wise, but also pre-calibration, just how they act. They have their own personality, I call it. And their personality is quite different than prior LG models.
Yeah, this definitely seems like they've taken more liberties. And so, just broadly speaking, overall, it is a great TV, but they're definitely, like every TV, there's always issues.
Yeah.
We'll cover a lot of those.
Yeah, that's why for me, I don't even attempt to bother with the pre-calibration because for me, post-calibration, the behavior is so much different that it kind of makes the pre-calibration irrelevant for me. That's why, I'm always an advocate for everyone to do a calibration either via yourself, learn how to do it on your own, and get someone to come in and do it, especially with these displays because they have so much potential that you're really missing out on a lot of, very fine details that you will not see pre-calibration simply because what you see in pre-calibration is what the factory can do on an individual unit within, for LG, I think it's 20-25 seconds of calibration that they do on the factory line. So it's only so much you can do in that amount of time,
Yeah, and I mean, even from C4 to G4, it's pretty stark of a difference for out of the box. And I cover both before and after, because obviously I have a large viewer base that is not going to have it calibrated. So I do try to present what they're going to see out of the box and then calibrate. And then my reviews, in the past, at least the last couple of years, I've been trying to do, 6 month later reviews after updates and, see what the landscape looks like and whatnot. So that's why I want to do this stream to kind of just give like a, how is the TV right now? Yeah. And then if I do a review later, it'll be months later, but I'm also leaning towards against doing reviews anymore. Just because, if someone has a budget for a 75-inch LCD, $1,000 or whatever, it doesn't matter what the review is. They're going to buy what's in their budget anyway. And it's most people don't understand the stuff that gets uncovered. Like the A95L, I haven't reviewed yet, even though I've been in the process of reviewing it for 7 months now. And it's just like at this point, not many people are going to care. They either have it or they're moving on to something else. So
yeah,
I think the way reviews traditionally have been done just doesn't help a lot of people. I can even tell by the viewer count. Review videos are by far the worst performing videos. So, I think having discussions about them, like in a stream, answering questions, because every single situation is different for everybody. Everyone's in a different environment. They have different room types, whatever their variables are. Just a simple review of a display just doesn't work to help them, I don't think, anymore. So I think just doing the streams, answering questions is more helpful.
Yeah, I have my own take when it comes on reviews. They are beneficial, but I agree with you. It depends on when you actually do it. So if you get a display in and you run you run the just let it run in basically for X amount of hours, and then you watch content on it, and you do calibration, whatever you do. you're really just scratching the surface of the potential of the display. And you really do need to put a lot of hours of actual usage in it. And when I say a lot of hours, I'm not speaking of 20 hours or 40 hours. You're going to have to spend at least a month worth of hardcore viewing to really get a feel and understanding of the display. So, I agree with you to an extent. And, that's one of the challenges that I see with the current viewers out of there. That they're missing a lot of stuff simply because they put their reviews out so fast. I get it, but instead of saying it's a review, it's more so of an overview of the basics of what they found within the small amount of time they've actually used the display.
Yeah, yeah, and it's like, the last few that I've done, I've tried to spend many months with them,
Yeah, yeah,
really find everything, and it's like, I think I've kind of become the person that people come to that reports on the livability issues, what's really wrong with these displays, because that's just the stuff that's not covered in reviews. There's just
yep,
not enough time and a couple weeks of a review to find that. Like,
yeah,
yeah, we'll talk about some of the other displays that are relevant right now to the G4 in a bit,
yeah,
but um, yeah. So anyway, I think this style might just be a little more helpful, especially
yeah,
because it's really only the enthusiasts that really care. Again, everyone else is just going to be, what size do I want? What's my budget? And then try to find something that, maybe they'll ask a few questions of, how's motion on this, or, gaming on that one or something. But
yeah.
yeah.
And basically, they'll go out and do their homework, and they'll pretty much listen to
Mhm,
who they trust, I guess, in the
mhm.
review space, as far as what their opinion is on it, and make their buying purchasing decision. So I get it, but at the same time, yeah, yeah, you're missing out a lot because you don't spend enough time with it.
Yeah. All right. FOMO, thank you for the super chat. He's listening as he does a zone 2 run this morning. Yeah.
What's up, FOMO?
So let's see. All right. So like the C4 out of the box measures how I would expect an LG. Like there was no surprises with the C4. Um,
Hmm.
maybe some people might be surprised though, because like they did not market like any real improvement, but I think the C4 is the biggest C series improvement that the C series has seen.
Yes,
But I'm
it's a
just saying, like,
sleeper series from
yeah.
LG. Absolutely.
Yeah, just as far though as like it's when I measured it, when I calibrated it, nothing was out of the ordinary. With the G4, that's not the case at all.
Yeah.
Let me pull up something here. Let me see, where is it? So out of the box. All right, so here's my out of the box measurements. Uh, so this was HDR10 for 1,000 nits. You can see it actually is. LG went from crushing near black before to now raised, and it actually raises through most of this. Um, but this is what this actually is I tested doing a custom tone map upload, just changing the luminance value and nothing else.
Hmm.
So no 1D LUT or whatever. I did that first, and it will actually, let me find it. It pretty much flattens it out. So if they could just release an update to uh, hang on, where is it? If they release an update to change that luminance value that they default to, then that would basically, you know, fix this lift. Um,
Well, the lift and what you're seeing is it depends on the actual unit because again, each unit has its own
yes, yes, there's
light max
definitely
output.
variants. They're not all the
Yeah.
same.
Yeah, I think the default that they chose was I think
It's
it's
got to,
1480.
yeah, it's got to be somewhere in the 14s. Whereas like each one I've seen has been about 15.
Hmm.
Um, so like just setting it to 15 flattened it out.
Yeah.
Let me see, was it this one?
Oh, Joyous, my Calman just crashed.
No. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, the way the tone mapping file on the TV is essentially setting that luminance value will alter the EOTF tracking. But yeah, so straight out of the box, it does lift a bit. I also saw the same lift in Dolby Vision.
Hmm.
So and then if you measure or even check, like Spears and Munzel with their tone mapping pattern that has all the lines going across up to 10,000 nits, and then you can change the metadata on the player or the disc. You can see how with LG, if you send it 1,000, it'll go to 1,000 and clip. If you send it 2,000, it goes to 2 and then clips. If you send it 4, it goes to 4 and then clips. So their out of the box tone mapping is set up to just show all detail at the expense of luminance. And you can really see this in content. So like if you go to Mad Max, in the part where they're driving into the storm, there's a lot of bright white flashes from the lightning, and there's one in particular that I like to use. It's only a couple of frames long, so it's a little hard to get the pause right, but if you can go frame by frame on your player, there's a spot where the camera is looking at the guy driving, and then there's lightning in the distance, and then you can see his face reflected in that window for a few frames. So pausing on that, and if you either play with the tone map upload through Calman or any other software, or just use the professional toggle. Let's say you set it to 100 so that it gets closer to a hard clip. That face in the window disappears. It's just all white. The lightning just spreads out and is just this white blob. If you turn it down to 10 or use the off, like everything just off for their tone mapping out of the box, you get all the detail. You can see like the reflection of his eye through the goggles and everything in that reflection off the window. You see every line for the lightning, but you do see how muted it looks because it's losing so much luminance. And so, that's what the control is for. Is one, it's preference. What do you want? Do you want more detail or more brightness? And then two, for me, I just try to find a balance. Like, where do I feel like it's okay to sacrifice maybe a little bit of detail to gain that extra brightness? And this also greatly affects the colors too. A few frames later, and then there's like red and fire and whatever from the storm, and doing the same thing. It's like if you leave it either in off or have it down really low so that it's aggressively tone mapping, you're going to see that fire is like just basically red, but very flat looking. But as you increase that slider, or if you're using, like I said, an upload and you set a higher value, you start to gain the luminance back, and then you get more like dimensionality look to that fire. But at the same time, with fire, LG leans really heavily on that green subpixel because that's brighter than red or blue. So you have white, green, and red essentially making this fire, so then it turns like a yellowish green almost the higher you go on the slider or the more you let it clip.
Is this out of the box or post calibration?
Either. It's just however you set the tone mapping. Like if it's really, really bright fire, you'll see it go from red to like a greenish yellow, the more you let it clip. So it's finding the fine line of, because like all content's also different. You can throw in a different 4,000 nit or near higher graded movie like Crimes of Grindelwald with the fire dragon at the end. That's the metadata says it's 3,500 something, whatever, and it's don't know exactly, but it's up there, and so that fire is different, I guess you would say, than what's in Mad Max. So you might want a different setting or a different tone mapping upload for different content, and it's looking at a lot of different content takes a lot of time to find where do you feel like you can preserve the detail that you want in all this different content while not sacrificing too much of the luminance.
Yep, and you're just hitting the nail on the head with the greatest challenge when it comes to tone mapping. Tone mapping itself is an opinion on how to display luminance beyond the display's capability. So it can and it will alternate between content. It can and will alternate between individuals looking at it. It's too subjective. So for me, I really do wish there were some standards around tone mapping so that this subjective and opinion-based idea of tone mapping can, kind of be reduced. But I mean, that's the problem with tone mapping. I don't personally see we will ever see any consumer display out there that will never not use tone mapping simply because of the energy restrictions that display manufacturers have to deal with on the consumer side.
Yeah, and it's like this is where I wish Dolby Vision and HDR10 Plus were better implemented in a wider range of displays and the way that they're just used in general. Because like the G4, I absolutely prefer the Dolby Vision on it. It has less posterization, it's cleaner, near black. It's obviously it's not perfect still, um,
Mhm.
but it is absolutely what I'm going to use when it's available on the G4. And that's not always the case. Like with Sony's, I generally turn off Dolby Vision. Um,
Yeah.
and
Well,
it's like the point of that is to take away that guesswork with the tone mapping, and you're just going to do what Dolby says that it should be, and then the creator designed the content with those specific tools. So it, then you don't have to worry about are you seeing not as much detail as should be there.
yeah, you're not worried about outside of the content creator's opinion of tone mapping and how it should be done. So yeah,
Mhm.
that's right. Now, when it comes to Dolby Vision on other displays, in particular the Sony, any bugs that you see, the actual fix for it has to come from Dolby, and Dolby is notoriously slow in bug fixes on displays. Back when the LGs had issues, and they still do have issues with some Dolby Vision stuff, especially posterization. Like during what year was that? I want to say that was either the C10 or the C1s. Basically, during the pandemic era, there were some posterization and coming out of black, and it took forever for that to be corrected. And the same thing is happening with Sony. That's why you haven't seen a true fix for it yet, because Sony is still working with Dolby to correct the problem. But it will be
Mhm.
fixed. Rest assured, it's going to be fixed. Just the question of when, I don't even know that.
Yeah, and also which of the issues, because there's more than one, but um,
Yeah, well, they have a list. I
yeah,
know you've given them a list. I've given them a list. I know other people have given them a list. So I mean, they have a
mhm,
log of what's going on, and it
yeah,
does vary from unit to
mhm,
unit. But and I mean, there's some other factors that will come into play also, as far as exacerbating the actual issue. How you calibrate the display will also impact what you see.
yep.
So
All right, 1 second here. Thank you, H2O, for that generous super chat. Well, I do a tutorial video on G4 calibration. Doesn't have to be professional level, rather for amateurs using basic tools. Um, Man, so that's kind of two different topics there because I don't know if I'd recommend getting it calibrated with like the I1 type meters. So part of our discussion is so before like if you wanted to run an AutoCal 1D whatever, like usually it comes out pretty fine. Maybe you touch up a little bit here and there, but um, with the G4, it requires a lot of manual touch
yeah,
up.
yeah.
Pretty much like the whole thing essentially, and is a pain. So it's not exactly something I'd recommend for average user. Uh, and certainly the better equipment will help. That said, like if you have I1 or whatever, and you just want to do like I say 2 point, but really I only recommend adjusting gain. So really it's a 1 point just to fix your white. But at least the ones I've seen are pretty close to D65, so you might not even really need to do much there. And then measure your luminance value so you can do a tone map upload that's going to fix the EOTF tracking mostly. Get a lot better anyway. Things like that is generally what I'd recommend if you have the consumer gear.
For me, when it comes to calibration, I've s- I can say this: if you have like an i1 Pro 3 or Pro 2 or whatever, and you do have one of the ID3s, you can calibrate it,
Mhm.
but you're going to be limited on the lower end of what you can do. And also, it's going to be time consuming. Do not, and I mean do not, rely solely on AutoCal to fix it. AutoCal from Calman on these G4s, no.
Yeah.
You will be better off just simply going in like I do. If you want to use the DDC controls, just go in and manually adjust the DDC controls for the 1D
Yeah.
LUT.
Yeah.
It's just What the auto cal does, I still don't even know. I have no idea why it's doing the things that it's doing.
I mean, and that's something that could be fixed in an update. Always takes a little bit of time for Calman to get with LG and get their update out, and maybe when they add official support for it, and maybe there's something they can work out, make it better later. But as of right now, anyway, it is very manual, time consuming to get the 1D LED and HDR and Dolby done.
Very much so.
SDR is pretty much the same. Like nothing's really different there. It's just the tone mapping or whatever is happening, especially on the upper end below 100. So from like 75 to 100 is just in constant fluctuation.
Right.
Do you want to throw up
Yeah.
that chart you had
Well,
showing that?
well, let me show you what you can do first with not AutoCal, the DDC controls. If you manually adjust it and not allow AutoCal to do its thing. Let's see here, video, share screen.
Alec, thank you for the super chat. Thinking of moving on from my A95L to G4 because those unfixed issues. What do I think in terms of picture quality? So we're going to talk more about it. For me, the A95L is a fantastic looking TV most of the time, but there is a looming issue that's not discussed enough, I don't think. And obviously, it's very hard to try and put into perspective failure rates. But there is
T-Con
an
issue.
issue with the T-Con on these A95Ls, and it's making it to where I'm not comfortable recommending buying a flagship display where I know of personally 5 people that have it that have had T-Con failures and had to have it replaced, and there's no guarantee that's not going to happen again out of warranty. So until that is somehow actually addressed or known to be fixed, it just really puts it into a place. Like, it doesn't matter if it was Sony or LG or Samsung or Hisense or TCL or whoever it was. We used to always joke, like, with Vizio, does it turn on? And that's not a
Right.
joke you want to have about one of the big 3 companies with their flagship.
Yep. And I will say this, as far as I know, anything manufactured April forward with the A95L should not have those T-Con issues. I think they did a revision on the T-Con. That's why if you do have the issue and you contact them, there's a very high chance they're just simply going to replace your unit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's what I've heard. Like, as soon as they hear that you got red lights and it
Yeah,
doesn't turn on, they don't even troubleshoot. It's
correct. They
just,
just
we're
replace it.
replacing it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's quite similar to with the G2s and with the LGs, where they had the power on issue with the 83-inch models, and they had to do a revision on the actual power board, one of the power supply boards. I mean, it's the same thing. I will say when it comes to the 8095L, picture quality wise, again, Sony is aware of these issues. They're working with Dolby with it. When they when they get the firmware update out, then it should resolve the problem. As far as I know, that will be in the next couple of firmwares. I just don't know the timeline for each one of those firmwares, but it's coming. Would I switch from a A95L to a G4? No.
Unless you're going up in size.
Yeah. Now, if you're doing 83, absolutely. But if you're 55 to 77, no, not at all.
Yeah, it's like, even for me, like, I think the S90, so the S95D, I personally do not like the coding. I don't think it was it's whatever. But I don't like the coding. Aside from the coding, I think it is a very underlooked TV at this point. There's not a lot of talk about it.
Yeah.
Even when I've shown it, like, it's, people want to know about LG and Sony, but the S95D actually is really good. There's a lot of cases where it's brighter. It's now has a decent BT 2020 mode out of the box that auto defaults to, at least in filmmaker and movie mode. Obviously it also still has some issues with some occasional frame skips or drops or whatever with the motion. Game mode is still the way that it's been, where it's not very accurate and requires a lot of adjustment. Little things like that. But the overall, I think the S95D, if that coating doesn't bother you, or if you have the room that it works in, so let's say you're putting the TV in front of windows, so the TV's, the windows facing the back of the TV, or you have really bright lights behind the TV or above or something, it's definitely a strong consideration too. I would
Yeah.
say it's really a pretty even matchup, for the G4, and just depending on which category you're looking at or what affects you. Again, this is why saying earlier, every person's different, their situation's different, um, but just don't overlook the S95D. Again, if you have a light over here facing the TV, then or a window, maybe then don't consider it. But aside
Yeah.
from that,
Well, yeah. For me, the S95D's coding doesn't bother me. It
Mhm.
doesn't bother me simply because it's the same coding that I see on micro LED walls. I do a lot of micro LED wall calibrations also. It's the same exact coding. Um, it, I get, how it's, kind of the opposite of what people are used to when it comes to OLEDs. I don't think Samsung is going to put that on next year's S95 series, but I mean, at this point, I don't personally have an issue with it because I see it, on other things out there. And yes, in certain use cases, it does do a far better job of managing reflections and lights hitting the screen compared to having a glossy screen. Like it really does.
Mm. Yep.
So,
Let's see comment
so
about the game mode. Yeah, just with Samsung's game mode, so they have the original game mode preset. So like if you hold the button to bring up the game bar and you go to original, that's so much better than standard, so much more accurate. It's almost like filmmaker mode. It's just what sucks is in HDR, you can't use that with the game HDR or HDIG mode. Like it automatically then forces you into standard. If they could change that, that would help, at least for the people who want accuracy in their game mode.
yep.
All right. So you wanted to share this
Yeah,
screenshot?
so this is just my calibration of my Filmmaker HDR mode um, using the DVC controls so that I can go all the way down to 1% stimuli and
Mhm.
correct it. And the benefit of manually doing these adjustments, the DDC controls are so fine that you can literally, this is a zoom in version of the target for D65. Only these points right here, which are going to be this point, and this point, are somewhat out of the box. You cannot achieve this accuracy just using AutoCal. Not at all. Not to
Mhm.
mention what happens in luminance between 70% and 100% via AutoCal, because when AutoCal is finished, it'll show that it's, somewhat of a flat line. But if you go back and measure it, these points right here are either going to be in luminance up here close to 2.6 or down here close to 1.8. And that's because the behavior and the actual personality of the G4, when you're measuring these points right here, um, it's even in the 2.2 mode, which is the gamma mode, it's doing some weird things with these luminance values right here. So it's really, really tough to make this completely flat. And this scan right here is actually, if I recall correctly, the fourth successive scan that I did just to make sure this thing was
Mhm.
super flat. I know you do the same thing.
Yeah,
Um,
like I
but
would.
the
Yeah.
only like dip that I have is right here, which is
Mhm.
fine because it's like 85%.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, this is how accurate you can get on a G4 in HDR with the right um, the right way of methodology, I should say, of doing the calibration and the amount of time that you have to devote to doing something like this. If you're an AutoCal person, you will never achieve this accuracy here. It's just not possible.
Yeah, yeah. I always tell people, after your grayscale is done, like hit the sweep button at least three
Yep.
times. I
Yep.
usually run it at least three times. Make sure it stays flat. And That's the thing too, like with at least this one, every time you sweep on this one, 75 seems to vary. I got it. You can get it like where it varies small amounts, either high or low, but it seems like the tone mapping or whatever is affecting the 75 read on mine. For the 65, I'm not gonna do the 83 yet. I'm gonna, one, get a lot more time on it, and two, it's constantly in use. So
Yeah, my 83 doesn't do what your 75% stimuli is doing your 65. And the 65s and the 55s that I've calibrated don't do it either. So again, that's just panel variance right there. Now, what I will say is that 75 spike that you see, I see that on my 42C3 all the time. And it's just the unit to unit variation.
all right, H2O, thank you again. He has a question for you.
Yeah. So let's see here. If I'm willing to stick with Calman's AutoCal and endure the time duration, would you not recommend it still, given I'm completely new to this field? I would recommend, if you want to do Calman, and I'm speaking of Calman in general, Calman is fine for doing the calibration. You can use AutoCal to do a rough draft of the grayscale, but from there, go back and manually adjust those DDC controls yourself. That's where the time comes in to get it right. So you can do it on your own, and it's just going to take you a while to get it perfect. But yes, just do it that way. I do not recommend doing AutoCal standalone. It is not appropriate for the G4 because of the behaviors that the G4 does with its luminance.
Yeah, and also when you're doing, so let's say it finished the AutoCal, and then you hit the read series, so it does a fresh sweep. You always want to pay attention to the 100 luminance reading, because it's going to fluctuate, and when it fluctuates, your chart's going to fluctuate, and the target for the luminance for each point will fluctuate. So I always try to either time it, or find like what is the most consistent luminance value that it's doing. So like on mine, it was like 1500. So whenever I would hit read sweep, I'd always want to make sure that it was at or extremely close to 1500, because if it would say 1470, then everything else is going to change, and then you end up overcorrecting and have to redo it.
Yep. Here's a tip for you guys on doing something like that. Let me go back and share my screen real quick one more time. Here's a good tip for you guys. So when you're dealing with doing a calibration in Calman, or it can be any calibration program, what you can do, because your 100% is going to fluctuate, in the beginning, before you start calibrating, I would just calibrate 100%, put it on a black window or full screen, let it cool down, then go back and remeasure it, see what the values are, and find a basically a decent average of what it's doing at that max brightness. Then go into the tool set here under workflow and select this like I've done here, and just put in a value. That way, once you are going here and starting to redo your measurements here to get the gamma correct, you don't have to worry about this 100% fluctuating anymore and messing up your actual luminance value targets for everything else. Just hard code in what the 100 will be on average, because yes, it's going to fluctuate. So you want to make sure that value that you do hard code is a best guess of what the actual display will be doing with regular content. So that is a super easy way to ensure that you can actually get and nail that gamma correctly for all the other values.
Yeah. Can you put that back up for a sec?
Yep.
So
Sure.
H2O, it's DDC. So what happens is after you make the connection to the LG TV, each of those points you can adjust from the computer. So you go to open the DDC window, and then you'll have all of these grayscale points. It would be
Yep.
so on the top right where it says display connect,
There you go.
you would connect it to your LG. This menu would change, and then there would be a little thing next to it that says DDC. So that's what he's talking about. And then That lets
Yeah.
you manually adjust each point instead of relying on it.
Yeah, at the top, you'll see an arrow here, and you might see an arrow there. You just click on that arrow right there. Or actually, I'm sorry, no. You'll see a little computer monitor screen right beside this
Mhm.
actual box right here. Those are the
Yeah.
DDC controls. So you click on that, and then a drop-down box will populate.
Yeah, yeah, and these points are not the same as what's in the TV. So you don't use what's in the user menu.
Yeah, let me see if I can find a quick DDC of an old display that
Mm.
let me go back. Let me do this one. This is an 83 G3 DDC window real quick so that you'll get an idea of what you're looking at here. Let's see here. Stop sharing that.
All right, while you're doing that, let me answer this. I have all right. So the Bravi 8 is the XR80. Again, Bravia 789 is their series. They actually do have model numbers. They're XR 70, 80, 90. So the XR80, I haven't seen one yet. They're not out yet. However, from what I have seen, there's no change like in reported power usage or anything. So I expect it to be very, very similar to the A80L, except it's going to have the new user interface that they're switching to and things like that.
I think the Bravi 8 also has the Pentonic chipset in it.
Yeah, all the new ones have the Pentonic with that new
Yeah.
menu and user interface.
Yeah, so it's basically going to be an A95L with a WRGB module in it and whatever advancements they've done for this series in conjunction to the Pentonic chipset. But yeah, this is the DDC window basically. So when you do see that little computer monitor right beside that display control, this is what you're looking for, and it just say RGB adjust. Now, speaking of this, this is why I don't like AutoCal, especially on these G4s. For some reason, um, whenever it's doing its measurements, it's on 100% stimuli instead of leaving the peak alone, whichever one measures the highest, and then just reducing, well, excuse me, measuring the lowest or whatever, and then reducing the other two. It will change the values for all three. That's not what you logically should be doing. And that's the problem that I have. One of the issues that I have with the AutoCal is it's just what it does is just weird.
Yeah, and it's like with the other LGs, usually after AutoCal, if you go in DDC, you'd have to, maybe touch up a few points, a few clicks here or there, and generally
Yeah,
that was fine. With the
yeah,
G4, it's if you're clicking, you're sitting there clicking for multiple minutes on one point, essentially, like it's that far off, and you're better off just erasing. Like if it
right,
says 67.3 whatever, and that you need more luminance, you're gonna have to add it, type in like 66 point something or whatever to get it
yeah,
close, and then keep doing it over and over until it lands where it should be.
right, yeah.
So, all right. All right. So, and then moving back into the G4 now with other issues aside from, just calibration pain. Anything that you don't like about it? Issues like for me, the posterization on HDR10, especially coming out of black last year, was really bad. Is one of the reasons I didn't recommend the G3 really. And then this year they've definitely improved it, but it's also still not gone. It's still there.
Yeah, well, that's going to be in the 3D LUT. They have redone completely the 3D LUTs
Mhm.
on the G4s compared to the G3s. Um, there are significant differences between the two.
Yeah.
Even if you load your own custom 3D LUT on the SDR side, or you do a matrix LUT on the HDR side, you're still going to be interacting with the modifications that LG has done LUT wise. So for me, the posterization on the lower end on the G3 series was a pain, but that was more so in relation to them attempting to copy how Panasonic and Sony do their WRGB management of those subpixels than anything. So I'm glad that they basically abandoned it and have gotten and done their own thing. The G4 is significantly better coming out of black, for me, I should say. But again, it can vary from unit to unit. One thing that has not changed on the HDR side is the posterization on the high end, which you can clearly see if you are using like the intro to the Spears and Monso montage. That ringing posterization is still there in HDR, but it does not exist in Dolby Vision.
Yep, and that's again what I was saying earlier. Why I, as I'm watching it, I'm definitely using Dolby on it.
Yep.
At least where possible.
Right.
Let's see. So there's that. When it comes to the motion, I definitely think there's been not just the cinematic movement that has changed, but also just the de-jitter controls in general seem more fine, where 1 and 2 are much less, soap opera effect or smoothing effect than prior. I was trying out 2 personally, and then I did start to see a little bit more soap opera or smoothing than I like, so I did drop it down to 1, but it used to be where even at 1, it was just too aggressive, like immediately obvious. So I do like that they've improved and helped the motion. I think also if you turn all the motion stuff off and you just have 5.5 pull down, I think it has the best native, no added interpolation motion of any of the TVs right now. But I also don't like where, like I said, 1 and 2 are pretty mild. 3 is a pretty moderate jump over 2, and then 4 is just like, here's all the soap. Like that's just a big jump. So there's definitely room for them to improve that for the people who do like interpolation. Cinematic movement, I think, has become more soap opera effect than before. I think it was more mild last year, but this year it's variable. And so when it does vary to where it's adding more interpolation, it's very noticeable.
Yeah, I've never personally cared for cinematic motion or even any of the any of their user menu stuff, the manual stuff.
Yeah.
Especially when you're looking at stuff from like cable. Just case in point, the other day I was watching something on FX, and as it was panning, there was this start film stutter that was there, and I had it on the user adjustment where I was playing with the de-jitter settings, and it was causing frame skipping and frame dropping. As soon as I turned it off and just used the real cinema, all of that stuff went away. So it depends on what you're using it for. I guess if you use a source that's natively spitting out 24 or 2396 frames per second, it's better. But if it's trying to extract those 24, 23.96 from a stream that is 60 hertz, it has a lot of work for me to still resolve. Like it's not usable for me at all.
Yeah, this is why I always tell people use whether it's Apple TV or a Fire Stick or Cube or Shield or whatever, something that you can either match the frame rate for you or let you change it. I do not use personal or built-in apps on any TV. Like I don't care if it's Tizen, Google, WebOS. I don't go to I set it up so it goes straight to an HDMI port, and that's it.
I don't use any of the internal apps because of that. All of the internal apps on the display is 60 hertz, so you're going to have to extract those 24 frames per second. I will say, even on the Apple TV, it just depends on the app as far as if it's going to do native or not. Like I have DirecTV Stream, so what the Apple TV is spitting out is going to be always basically 1080p 60 or 59, whatever it is, simply because that app doesn't do any type of changing in the actual refresh rates. So Netflix, perfectly fine. Hulu, perfectly fine. Prime, fine. Apple TV Plus, fine. Basically, any of the other apps is fine. It's just your TV cable channel apps don't expect it to do anything outside of probably 1080p 60.
All right, so there is also this issue, bug, whatever, that apparently LG is aware, and they're working on a firmware fix for it for HDMI 2, which is the eARC port, which is unfortunate because that's going to be the most used one, where the image can distort when you're switching between HDMI devices. A lot of people have this
Ew.
issue. If you do have something like this happen, you know, for me, all I've had to do is just hold the power button until it turns off and turns back on, and it fixes it. Others have to unplug the TV. Um, Either way, like if you get a distorted image after changing your HDMI ports, that's what you do for now until they update it and fix it. But they did say it's something they're working on, or at least that's what somebody else said that they said.
Yeah.
We'll get confirmation when we can.
Yeah,
Um,
I don't use eARC, so I've never seen that issue on my HDMI too.
yeah, I pretty much only use two. I don't have to switch the ports, so it's not
Yeah,
really an issue for
I
me.
get it. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I get it.
So there's a comment here about A95L. Um, where did it go? Right here with the scuff marks out of the box. So because they don't put a plastic film screen protector on the screen, the foam can move against the display, even though there's the white paper sheet or whatever it's made out of, and it can cause scuffing. Now, generally, the scuffing is not visible in content, and it's only visible if you get up close to the screen and shine a bright light on it. It's the same thing with the A95K last year. But every now and then, so like this is the one that I have right now.
Hmm.
This scuff was really bad, and it absolutely is visible. Um, like that was a deep scuff or whatever you want to call
Yeah,
it, and that is
kind of like
absolutely
styrofoam
visible.
right there.
Yeah. So if you get something like that, that's a return.
Absolutely,
um,
yeah. Yeah, for me, I think recently they've updated their packaging where they are putting some type of film on the edges, like a clear film around the edges. So, if, like I said, if you're getting something that's relatively recent as far as the build date, I would say April forward, you might see that they've already started putting that film on top of the screen before they put the extra layers on top of to eliminate this problem. On my displays, yeah, there's some minor, it's actually not even considered minor. There's some stuffing there, but I don't see it unless I'm right up on the screen. It's not visible to me in content. It's not visible to me if I'm greater than a foot away with the screen off. So it's just one of those things. Yes, it's a shame Sony did not or does not, or I should say, have not thought in before now to actually put some type of film on top of their screen, so to ensure that the friction from rubbing during shipping does not create these problems. But lesson learned, I guess, for them.
yeah. All right. So let's move on to the sharpness and sharpening. At
Yeah.
the LG workshop event that I went to, this is what's making me wonder, like, is this on purpose? Is this a miscommunication between departments? Is this a bug? Because one of the main things that they wanted to point out, and they use a zone plate to show it, is that they don't have ringing because they don't over sharpen the image. And that
Hmm.
was how it's just always been with LG. This year, they've kind of,
Change something.
yeah. And now there's ringing, and it's like, so obviously this is just a cell phone picture, so it's going to make the screens look worse, and you have two different technologies, so they're going to look green and pink. They aren't. So we have the G4 on the left, and you should only see like the rings here going outwards, and that's
Yeah,
it.
you should
These
not
little
see that.
circles should not be here.
Yep.
Now the Sony's down here. Let me the Sony's down here, which
Yep.
has one more ringing and this giant starburst effect, and then we have the Samsung, which is a little kind of in the middle, like that still has the starburst thing. And then if you like get up close and if you wanted to count these little circles, it would go Sony has the most, Samsung is in the middle, and then LG has the least. So it's not as aggressive as the over sharpening on Samsung and Sony, but it is a disappointment to see that they went that route for me.
With the other the units, those were out of the box, right?
Mm. With the LG, I turned the sharpness 10 to 0, didn't make a difference, but I just
No,
checked
no,
it
no, no,
anyway.
no. Yeah, but I'm saying
Um,
on the Samsung and the Sony, were those all of those were out of the box, right?
in filmmaker professional, and the Sony was at its default 50 sharpness, and yeah, Samsung at 0.
Yep. So reality creation was turned on the
No,
Sony.
I turned off all the clarity stuff. So reality creation, smooth gradation, that was off. Um,
Hmm.
if you can put the Sony into PC mode, it changes. But
Yeah.
they've made it now where it detects the device, and you can't do that for, say something playing a Blu-ray player or whatever. Whereas in the past, you used to just change the picture mode to graphics. So, but yeah, that was definitely reality creation turned off and smooth gradation turned off.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, in real content, I don't really see, too many issues, ringing artifacts, whatever. It's just like I said, I'm kind of unfortunate that's there, but it does. One part of this pie that is leading to the the extra dimensionality and depth that the G4 is offering.
Yeah.
Um,
It's intentional.
yeah.
They're adding a sharpener. Guess you can call it contrast sharpener to the actual image. It was in direct relation to feedback that they've received in regards to their processing. And
Mhm.
it overall, even for me, it does help bring detail into visibility uh, after a certain distance from the screen. So that's why it's there. I know purists would like to have the features turned, have the capability of turning it off. So would I, but that's why it's there. Now, when you set the actual sharpness setting to 0 and turn everything else off, it should be off.
Mhm.
But it is an always on sharpener right now. Whether or not they're going to change it to make it where when you reduce everything to 0 or turn everything off, that it goes off, that in itself is a question that I don't have an answer for. It's kind of similar to their always on dynamic tone mapping that they've included this year on the G4. I mean, it's you can't turn it off. It's totally separate and totally and completely different than the dynamic tone mapping setting itself that you have access to in HDR. That's not what I'm talking about. It's an always on, probably pixel level enhancer for HDR that is always on.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what that does, like, um, so tone mapping isn't something that's going to make the panel performance better, but tone mapping is something that can reduce panel performance depending on the content. So with Sony, for years now, they've been able to just target the highlights and leave the rest of the image alone, and their tone mapping is dynamic tone mapping all the time. It
Yep.
ignores whatever the metadata says. It just does what Sony says.
Yep.
Uh, LG is kind of emulating that now, but then
Yep.
Samsung still, like, if it's not 1,000 nit content, like, the Samsung is going to default to its 4,000 nit. So if there's no metadata, or if it's over 1,000, the Samsung is just going to be, here's our 4,000 nit curve, and they apply it to the entire image. So then the entire image gets dimmed down. And this is where I've said before how, like, QD OLED absolutely has this native inherent advantage with color and, color luminance and whatnot. But when you have the tone mapping bringing the luminance down so much where it doesn't need to be, that's where it's restricting that advantage. And that's
Yeah.
where, with the G4, depending on how you have the tone mapping set up, it could have brighter colors in certain situations than what Samsung's doing, or even what Sony doesn't, depending on the scenes. Like if you were watching 2,000 nit content on the Sony and the LG is brighter with more detail because Sony's going to be clipping, and it depends on the APL of the image and everything else. But especially on the Samsung, though, that's like the one thing is when it goes to that 4,000 nit curve that they use, it applies to the entire image. And so, like, pretty much everything HDR. I think everything HDR on YouTube. Obviously, I haven't looked at everything, but I don't think YouTube sends metadata, or it just defaults to 4000. Either way, that's why I like those HDR demos on YouTube are less bright. There's lower APL on the Samsung because it's aggressively tone mapping the entire screen. Now, if Samsung could change that and do what LG and Sony are doing now, then they could just tone map the highlights as needed, and you know in my opinion, it would be better. It's still subjective, but I think it's not really subjective when you're applying tone mapping where it doesn't need it.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, that's all in tone mapping schemes for manufacturers, and that's why everything is going to be subjective. When it comes to Samsung, yes, they can tweak that actual behavior for anything that does not have metadata, defaulting to the 4000. They can tweak that in a firmware update. That's a piece of cake to do. When it comes to comparing the Sony and the well, I should say the A95L and the G4, I'm getting some different behaviors between the two depending on what I'm watching. And I'm specifically speaking of 4,000 pieces of content. I will say that there is a huge improvement on the G4 when it comes to color luminance of P3 P3 clamped color content in HDR compared to prior years. But it's still, somewhat behind what I see in that same luminance on an A95L or an A95K for that matter. It doesn't really matter. It's just the luminance is still not equal to a QD OLED, even with P3 content. It's just not there. It's very close, but when you pause scenes, like I like to use Man of Steel or Batman versus Superman and some of the very bright, I guess you could see the beams and the plasma beam type things just to see the detail in those beams. Comparing that last night, I was just looking at A95L and a C3 along with the G4. Like the detail is significantly improved on certain scenes. I got to get those actual timestamps, but significantly improved on the G4, but it's still not showing as much detail as on the QD OLED in that same scene. But if I switch to another piece of content that has 4,000 in metadata, it's completely opposite. It looks better on the G4 compared to the A95L. It just depends. That variation. I mean, I don't know. It's really weird how it's doing it. Sometimes I wonder if there's a bug in the actual power management of the 83 G4, where it can fluctuate. Sometimes it's overly aggressive and kind of reducing the overall brightness of specular highlights or just even a high APL scene. I don't know, but this is where sitting and actually being with the unit and not trying to create a review within 20 or 40 hours of usage comes into play, because these are troubleshooting items that I'm seeing and I've seen since day one, but I'm still trying to isolate exactly what the actual cause is. I don't want to call it a bug yet, but that's where I'm leaning towards, simply because it varies from one piece of content to another piece of content. It's just different.
Yeah, and it's like everyone has their go-to handful of scenes that they know is going to be high graded, be whether it's 4,000 nits or whatever, and have a lot of color luminance, whatever. And then if you just are looking at that, then you're gonna be able to come to a conclusion that one is better because you looked at, say, 5 or 6 pieces. But when you look at a whole lot more, it's not always the case. And like on Spears and Munzel on the new disc, they don't have 4,000 anymore. They have the 1,000, 2,000, and then it goes to 10. And it's like if you watch the 1,000, A95L is clipping in places where it should not clip. Like there's no reason for it to be clipping clouds at 1,000 nits on that disc, in my opinion. Again, but that's just the way their tone mapping is. And then you go to 2,000, you get a lot of clipping. Whereas on the G4, it isn't clipping and it's showing it brighter. So it just depends on the metadata, the way the tone mapping set up, what Sony, what they're doing. It's like, again, panel capability wise, an A95L in smaller windows is going to measure brighter, in larger windows is going to measure brighter. Obviously has huge color advantage. Well, maybe not huge, but the native panel technology, there's obvious color advantage. And so just like on paper, it should just be like an always winning thing, but it's really not. I would say like in most streaming content, the G4 is either a complete match, or in the few areas where the tone mapping is being applied where it shouldn't, whatever, then G4 is a little bit higher. But that's like all 1,000 nit and lower. If you're trying to stay in the 1,000 to 2,000 range where you're like at the limits of the actual panels, and seeing what they're doing, that's where I see the G4 getting brighter and showing more detail than the Sony. When you get to 4,000, it's really mixed, and it also depends on what you're putting the tone mapping setting at. I put my tone map upload for 4,000 at 50, which is a little bit, it's basically in the middle, because like out of the box, it's really close to what 10 would be. So that it's just pure detail, not as much brightness. Putting it at 50, you gain a lot of that brightness back. You still have a lot of the detail. I think you go a little bit higher, so you're going to clip a little bit more, have a little bit more brightness. If you set it to 100, then obviously it's going to really clip a lot. So it's just, again, subjective. Do you want brightness or detail? And it makes it where, depending on what you're watching, there's no way to say one is clearly going to be brighter, more performative than the other because of tone mapping having to be at play at all. In an ideal situation, we wouldn't have tone mapping and the content would fit the display.
Right. Well, I'm not seeing some of the things that you're seeing with the 2,000 nit content between an A95L and the G4. And I'm also the out of the box on the G4 that I have, it's tone mapping for 4,000 nits. It is 50. No, sorry. It's 60. I'm sorry. It is 60. So I don't know.
Well, the professional weird. Toggle will default to 60. I'm saying when it's off.
No.
But every time I compare with 4,000, it's very, very similar to the 10 setting when it's out of the box.
Yeah, no. Measure it. I'm looking at measurements.
I did. Yeah, okay. I measured. Yeah, out of the box, the curve at 10 is very similar to having it off.
Yeah, that's not on mine. So yeah, that again, but I mean, it could be unit to unit variation. I don't know. I know for mine, it is for 4,000, it is at 60. I can see that in the measurements, and I can play with that. Doing a manual adjustment. I can throw in 60 and measure it, and it's identical to what I saw, without messing with that tone mapping whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So that's just weird. Yeah, that's weird. But with the A95L with 2,000 nit content, I'm not seeing it hard or clip any detail faster than the LG. But I mean, again, that's going to be dependent on what tone mapping parameters you're loading into it. I'm doing everything post calibration. I know you're doing stuff pre calibration. So
I've calibrated both now. I'm going after.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I'm not seeing that. So I know you're using a splitter. I know your splitter is different than mine, but I know one of my troubleshooting things that I do also, just to make sure that it's not a piece of equipment in between the two displays. I have two Oppos, and I have two of those of the same disc for evaluation. I just do it that way. And yeah, and I'm not seeing it. Even, I mean, through my split, I'm not seeing it. And when I put it separate, I'm not seeing it. So that's interesting. Not saying there's something wrong with your stuff. I can't recreate it here. So
You know, so on the Spears of Munzel 2000,
Yeah.
at the beginning, you know, the one that has just like the
The
upper right
peak.
corner, the white
Yeah.
cloud, like
Mm-hmm.
that one clips on the Sony. Doesn't
Yeah.
like I've done it in the Panasonic, the Sony player. I have a AV Pro Edge 2.1 matrix switch.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I'm not seeing that here. I
mm,
yeah, I'm not seeing that. So it might be the players. I don't know. I just say I'm not seeing it here between those two displays. Now, what I will say is the APO brightness difference between a C4, uh, C3, or any of the series is not, like a G3 or G4. The APO difference um, is significantly different when spitting out, well, giving the display 2000 nit content compared to the 1000 nit. Like when I'm doing 1000 nit comparisons with any of the prior years LGs outside of the G3, I'm saying, yeah, G3, or even looking at stuff recently with non-MLA tech, the difference in brightness with 1000 nit content is there, but it's not like it's startling. Like, wow, it's a
yeah.
night and day difference. As soon as you put in a 2000 nit piece of content or higher, yeah, it becomes different.
Yeah.
It's just a totally different animal. Like, it's like, oh my goodness, like this is completely different. And just comparing 65 C2 that I have with the G4 here on that same 2000 nit content. Number one, the APO brightness difference is double. The detail difference, like with the horses in the snow, like there is significant clipping on the C2 compared to the G4 that is literally just showing all of the details.
Hmm.
Um, but it is a startling difference. So any variations between prior years models, or even again current year models, can and will vary depending on the content that you send to display. It seems that for me and what I have here, the LG likes content that is greater than 1000 nits on max ELL for it to really shine.
Hmm. All right. Bat Tech, thank you for the super chat. Um, Explain this to me, like, I don't know much about Calibrator, I don't, so people are now okay with LG overprocessing, it seems. Uh, the general person might be. I'm not. I've been complaining for years about, Sony's offsetting basically being the low setting, for their, different clarity menu settings, and how I wished I had the ability to turn it off. Whether someone actually, prefers it one way or the other is up to that person. I'm saying it's a step back, in my opinion, that LG is doing this with the sharpening and so on without a toggle to actually defeat it. But in real world viewing, is it that much of a difference? Not really. If you have the
No.
displays right next to each other, it's sometimes, one's a little sharper than the other, but they're all doing it now.
Yeah,
It's
I just
hard.
want the feature to be able to be turned off,
Yeah.
and allow the actual owner of the display to be able to choose whether or not they want to have that additional processing or completely eliminate it. That's the capability that is missing on the LG, has always been missing on the Sony, unless you do certain things to bypass it. And I guess on the Samsung is also
Mm.
missing. You can't turn it off completely. So
Yeah,
it's
that's
just one of those things.
yeah, one thing Sony, or not Sony, Samsung has done for years is like their smooth gradation filter, whatever. There's no control for it. It's just is what it is. Now they do have really good gradient handling, especially like even in game mode or whatever. They have least amount of posterization, but there are times where you can see that there is like a slight, you know, detail difference in certain situations, but that they don't even give you control over it. And that's kind of the complaint that we have, is we want to be able to control it and see how it works in different content. And that's also why, like, in certain dark low bit rate content, the Samsung is going to flicker when it's, say like a really dark sky with macro blocking in it, whatever. You can see that flicker occasionally.
Yeah, which brings up a great transition, smooth gradation. When it comes to the LGs, for me, I think it's best to be left off.
Yeah. I mean, if
it
you
causes too
use
many
it at
problems on the
all,
low end.
if you use it at all low, but the same thing with the A95L. I see flickering and issues when it's on low. So I say just leave smooth gradation turned off on both.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Alex, thank you for super chat. Thanks for sharing knowledge and education. Maybe you can do a Sony calibration stream too. Have a hard time calibrating A95L. Depending on what you're using and how you're doing it, A95L should be really actually easy to calibrate. You can even really just do a 2-point if you want, or rather, again, a gain adjustment. I don't really advise many do a low end adjustment, especially if they're using i1.
I always do the 20-point controls on the Sonys simply because especially in the HDR side, number one, the way I do not know have I ever agreed with Sony's methodology of, basically calibrating SDR at whatever you calibrate it for a light output of, let's just say 100 nits, and then transposing that and into an HDR PQ. It's never been good enough for me. So at bare minimum, when it comes to the Sony, if you're doing a lot of HDR, I would say separate the HDR calibration from your SDR. But of course, on the Sony, you can't truly calibrate an HDR. You can, but it's kind of difficult. At bare minimum, when you're doing something for HDR, set the peak luminance to high, the OLED light to max, and then calibrate it like that to, I think it's a basic flat 2.2, and then allow that to be transposed over to the HDR side, and then you can tweak any discrepancies that you see, which will probably be on the lower end, and I'll say lower end from maybe 30% below with the 20-point controls. But that's another challenge with basically the CAN workflows in CalMan. You won't know any better as far as how far off those lower points are unless, one, you're looking at the raw numeric values compared to where they should be, or two, you have a zoomed in, basically like a bullseye chart like I have on mine, so that you can see where your points are measuring in relation to where they should be. So if I can, I'll go back to sharing my screen real quick so I can show you what I'm talking about here. But it doesn't exist, unfortunately, in CalMan. So this not out of the box. So it's one of those things. But this is why I have this right here on my actual calibration stuff. And I use the same thing or something quite similar for Sony. This allows me to visually see where the measurement is, and there's a square box right there that the measurement should be in. So if I go to black, that's the box that it should be in. And I also have the individual RGB balance measurement to the right, so I can see graphically here. And also, of course, I'm going to always look at the numerical values here. So this is why I think for me, it's important that you have the right tool set to do the job. CalMan out of the box is designed for ease of use. It is not designed for precision. You have to have a higher license with CalMan to go in and be able to edit these workflows, but you need to put the right tools on the workflows so that you can see things and make things better.
So in software and grading, they can set the luminance to whatever they want. So like in particular, the one darker scene that has the little yellow sun, and like depending on the TV and its tone mapping is gonna look entirely different from TV to TV. That was just added in there and set to 10,000 nits. So, and that actually is a good example though of QD, at least the A95L, being able to show really bright yellow versus the G4 if you use the 2000 or 10,000 nit grade of the disc, or even in Dolby Vision. Especially when it comes like yellows, oranges, fire, you were saying earlier, laser beams, stuff like that. That's where QD OLEDs really show an advantage. But again, if it's 4,000 nit content on a Samsung and it's being tone mapped down aggressively, then it's not going to show that as much.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. Yeah. When it comes to the 4,000 nit content and those plasma beams and things like that, one reference that I use when I do comparison between the displays is from Man of Steel. It's when Superman is in the World Machines plasma beam, the gravity beam, trying to basically terraform Earth, and he's trying to stand up. In that particular scene with the World Machine, on the older LGs, like the beam itself is basically blown out, so it's all white. On the G4 and especially the A95L, it is colorful and it has great detail in it, and that's one of the biggest improvements I can see with the MLA technology, and especially the G4 series, where it now gets closer to what QD OLEDs have been able to do from the very beginning of their introduction. Yes, on the A95L, it's going to be a little bit more saturated and have a little bit more detail in it. But again, on the A95L, you can't tweak the tone mapping parameters to either eke out more details or kind of subdue more detail in relation to having more brightness. It's just fixed, So that's one of the pluses that I give to LG, being able to allow myself to go in and tweak that for my personal use or a client's use itself. That's why I like LG in that actual aspect with stuff. So yeah, I'm looking at your screen now.
Yeah, so this is the out of the box 4,000 curve on the G4.
Yep.
Again, they put the luminance value too low, so it's lifting, and then you can see here where the tone mapping starts, and then after I calibrated it, which would be this one, and I use 50, you can see now it doesn't roll off until later. So this is a visual guide of what we're talking about. So it's like whenever this doesn't follow the line, it's darkening. So that's not just like the white highlights, that's the color too, like the color difference that you're going to see. Like I was explaining with fire, the way that it is out of the box, fire is like red but flat, is the best way to describe it, with 4,000 nit content. Then doing it, even at 50, letting it get brighter, it gains some of that orangishness back. Like the color actual changes, and on top of getting brighter. Now that does also mean that in certain situations you're going to have less detail. Like there is going to be areas where it'll clip. I find this to be the balance that I went with right now. Anyway, I might change it later. But I'm just going through different 4,000 nit content, trying to find what the balance that I like.
Yeah, for me, when it comes to setting that stuff, sorry to cut you off, but I started to look at the dilution point of where that white subpixel starts to dilute colors. On the G4, it's somewhere in the 800 to 900 nit range, where you start to see some dilution from the white subpixel. So that's where I kind of aim when it comes to dealing with the tone mapping parameters, to ensure that to that point I'm getting, the full color volume for said material that I'm watching at that luminance value. And then after that, start to tone mapping. And, of course, that's where you're going to see some dilution here and there. You don't have to do that much you don't have to do such things like that with the QD OLED in that sense. It's something just different with them.
Okay. Yeah. And so how this curve affected 2000 nits. So this is the post cal with 2000. You can see that little kink for the 75, how it's starting to raise
Uh-huh.
up.
Yeah, right there.
But the drop in 80 is what it should be. So this little kink right here is just where, like, with 2000 nit content, it is going to be a it's pretty rare, I would say, between the capability of the TV, let's say, 1500 nits to 2000. So it's not going to be a lot of clipping, but there might be some occasions here and there with this particular roll off that you would have some clipping, but it will allow it to get really bright. Compared to
Yes.
the original out of the box 2000 was this one. So let me go back to, yeah, this one. So you can see again the lift, and there it's a very small area here shown, but it
Right.
is
Yeah.
different. It did change.
Yeah. It
Um,
did change. Yeah. Yeah.
and then with 10,000, I mean, 10,000, there's really no point in talking about. But I
Yeah.
mean,
Exactly.
yeah, that's
Yeah, it's just one of those things. It's like, and you also keep in mind you have to treat these things differently because the code values, of course, somewhat. Well, I shouldn't say code values. The brightness and how things are mastered does differ between a 4,000 nit piece of content compared to a 2,000 or 1,000 or 600 or 10,000
mhm.
or no metadata. It does vary. So that's what I'm saying. When comparing the displays, it's really difficult to, I guess, get a real take on things outside of, okay, this is how the display is tone mapping compared to this is how this display is tone mapping.
Mhm. This
And
is why I wish the A95L was accurate with the gradation preferred off.
yeah, well, yeah, so that you can do a hard clip.
Yeah,
You can get it close, but you sacrifice the light output.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, if they made it where you could just disable the tone mapping, then you'd actually get a real representation of the panel. Um,
Yep.
and then with LG, you can make it hard clip, so, or at least close to it. So it's like that would have been a good way to actually be able to tell. But as soon as tone mapping's involved, it's really hard to find the right content that you can actually determine, is it tone mapping that's affecting this, or is it a panel difference?
Yep. Exactly. Yep. Yep.
But
So
monthly skin, can you explain how Stacy Spears generated 10,000 without using 10,000 monitor? I mean, it's just like when I edit a
software.
video, I can just drag the slider up and make it as bright as I want. I have the waveform open and it tells me how high it's going. And
Yeah.
I
They,
mean,
they do all of that in Resolve. That's easy.
yeah, no, I mean, like, if you have the brightness turned down to what your display can do, and you can see the detail, and then you just start dragging that slider up. It's not that the detail's going away in the content; it's just going away off your screen.
Yeah.
You just need a screen that could show it. So, you know, this is why, like, the 4,000 nit monitor is going to be beneficial to creators, so they can actually get that pure visual representation. But it was never needed. Like, we've had 4,000 plus nit content for a long time without the monitors. Like, they can just do it in
Right.
software.
Yep.
Um, Thank you, Bushwhacked. In a previous video you showed related to sharpening highly textured scenes, how A95L had flashing artifacts. So that's mostly to do when it's a, like, high frequency over sharpening that Sony does. That's also in motion on, like, small high contrast areas. Um, so in particular on the Spears and Munzel, it has that interpolation scene where it's like going over that big round ball with the little circles in it, and whatever. Something like that is going to exhibit that, like, flicker or shimmering is really what it looks like. Uh, and on the G4, I have not seen that. Again, their over sharpening is less than what Sony is doing, but it's not to say that it couldn't happen with some certain content somewhere. Again, this is where you spend a long, long time looking at a lot of different stuff, just using it day to day, and then keeping an eye out for when things just look off. And
Yeah.
then,
Question for you, Classy, real
mm,
quick. When it comes to the Sonys, have you ever reduced? Have you ever kept reality creation on it and reduce it to one of the lower values? Say
yeah, I
like
think I've seen you say like
four.
4 or something.
Yeah,
Yeah, I've tried
it's
that.
and that it should make it better than turning it off. But again, it's not going to completely 100% eliminate what they're doing.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean,
So
and I get why they do it as well, not just because, the average person thinks it looks sharper, so, people like that,
yeah,
but
no, it's a lot
it,
more
it's
to
they
that. Yeah,
expect when you have like you can tell when reality creation is on. If you give it a good quality source, it's not really doing anything. You can turn it off and
right.
on, and you see nothing really changes. But if you give it low bit rate, 720p or lower, then you actually can see the effect that it's doing.
Yeah. Now with the A95L, they've added on top of that the XR Clear, which is a completely different animal, and
Mm,
it in itself has its own set of issues that I don't care for that
mhm,
particular um, algorithm at all, and it's a
mhm.
shame for me that I can't. I want Sony to be able to separate those two features so that I can turn XR Clear off. Can't turn it off.
Mhm. Yeah, a lot of people think that the clear image does more than it does. The main thing that it does is if you have an Apple TV or something and it's sending 4K, but the stream that you're watching on Netflix drops to 1440p or 1080p or something in that moment, the Apple TV is still sending 4K, and on another TV, it's not going to upscale or do anything. It just says, okay, I'm receiving 4K. The clear image is able to detect the original source of what the resolution and bitrate is and make changes to it that Sony feels like they should do on top of what the Apple TV or whatever device is doing.
Yep.
If you if you're watching Netflix and I forget if there's a command on Apple TV to show it. I know on like PC and whatever, there's a real easy command that brings up and it shows you the resolution and the bit rate and everything. Um, I think there's a developer mode or something you can get on the Apple TV to
On the
see
Apple,
all
yeah,
this.
it's a double mode. Yeah.
And you'll see how often, because Stacy Spears explained this to me, that when you're streaming video content, it comes in like, I think he said there's like 14 different levels of quality, and every 2 seconds, it's a 2 second block, it's going to move through those like 14 different levels essentially. And it's not just the resolution, it's also bitrate. So your bitrate and your resolution can fluctuate depending on the internet traffic or the connection, or Netflix's upload at the moment, or whatever. So having that on screen, a lot of times I'm watching something that says 4K and it'll say 1440p.
Yeah, well, that depends on the actual app itself also. It's not universal.
Yeah,
Um,
each Netflix app to each device is different. Just
yeah,
like each Amazon Prime. Like if you want the best version of Amazon Prime, you need an Amazon Fire Cube.
exactly. Well, uh, well, it depends now.
Mm,
Something's going on with Prime right now where I was looking at something earlier on I was The Expanse. I was going back and looking at some things that I use for evaluation on The Expanse, and on the Fire Stick that I have, it's no longer in HDR10 or Dolby Vision. It is only in SDR for this specific season, just this
mm,
season. Whereas if I go and look at it on the Apple TV, it's in HDR10. So it depends. But
mm,
yes, in general, anything on Prime will look best on a Amazon-based platform, a hardware platform, I should say, compared to their competitors. And it's the same thing with
mm.
Apple TV Plus or anything iTunes. Well, you can't get anything on iTunes outside of the Apple TV anyway. But Apple TV Plus looks way better on the Apple TV Plus than any other streaming device. Just
Yeah.
way
Yeah,
better.
I'm pretty sure the Apple TV average from what I've seen for Apple TV Plus is somewhere in like the 35 megabit per second range, whereas other streaming services are anywhere from the teens to the 20s. So
Yeah,
there's a
Apple TV
difference.
Plus is on the Apple TV. Apple TV Plus is anywhere from 30 to 35 megabits per
Mm,
second. Prime, I've monitored that it's in the mid 20s.
mm,
Netflix depends on what you're watching and whether or not they've converted their stuff over, which I think they've already have
mm,
completed most of it. But I mean,
mm.
you can get a stream that's in right at 20 megabits. Some of them will be 25, some of them go down to 15. Just depends on what it is.
Yeah. And the HDR flagging, that brings up it's another issue with A95L. You can
Yep,
be
you don't know.
watching, yeah, you could be watching the same show, like this episode 1, here's Dolby Vision. Episode 2, here's SDR. Episode 3, it's Dolby.
Yes.
Episode 4, it's HDR10. So that's another thing they need to fix is the flag detection.
Well, the flag detection, you know, the funny thing is, it used to work on the A1E, and then a firmware update, they took it off. It's for Dolby Vision, they took it off. But now it's like, yeah, it's like you have no idea what actual dynamic range you're looking at, or what, and if you're in HDR, what HDR format you're looking at, unless you go into the picture settings. Yes, Sony, you got to add a little icon saying, okay, this is such and such HDR or Dolby Vision or just plain Jane SDR. There has to be a flag there.
Oh, I mean, like the A95L, like if you're watching a show, it's going to not always read the flag from the show correctly. So, like episode 3 of show X might be in SDR when every other episode is, every episode is supposed to be Dolby, and then episode 6 might be HDR10. It's been an issue with the A95L since launch where the flagging, it doesn't go into the right mode for the show all the time.
That's a bug in the software.
Yeah, there's multiple EDIT issues with the TV.
Yeah, I resolved that here just simply doing a factory reset. Once I did that factory reset, I've never had that problem again. But I'm speaking more in general, just whenever it's receiving an HDR signal, you have no idea that it's in HDR mode. When it's Dolby Vision mode, you have no idea that it's in Dolby Vision mode until you go into the picture settings.
Yeah. All right. Well, I have to get ready for work here soon.
Yep.
If there's any last minute questions, send them in.
Yep. Getting back to the G4, because I know we've kind of covered a lot of stuff and bouncing from one thing to another.
Yeah.
For me, the G4 is a very, very good display. Actually, it's damn near excellent. It has a unique personality, but once you adapt to it, I mean, the end result is, I mean, the image post calibration for me is flawless. There are some bugs in its actual software that kind of is weird, like the professional toggle for the tone mapping thing. I think there's a bug in it where sometimes it's I don't even want to detail it too much. It's doing some things that it should not do, even after you've uploaded your own tone mapping scheme. So I think one of the opportunities I think for LG that will be beneficial for end users or even calibrators is with that particular toggle. If someone's uploaded a custom tone mapping parameters, you can turn the toggle on, but when you turn the toggle on, everything below it should be grayed out. That should indicate that, okay, the display is using what was uploaded per the actual user. It's not doing that right now. Right now, it's still becoming active, and you can toggle between the actual values, but it won't change anything on screen. But the toggle itself is doing some weird things with real content or even with measurements. So that, for me, that toggle is buggy. There's a bug in it somewhere. I don't know exactly what it is, but I'm gonna reach out to LG and give them my findings. But yeah, it's overall for right now. If you get your display calibrated, leave it off, or for now, just leave it off. If you leave it on, it may work, it may not work the way that it's supposed to work. So it's just one of those things. Other than that, for me with the LG, this on the 83-inch side, the uniformity is on the low end. It's much improved compared to prior generations of the 83-inch model. Like it's significantly improved, especially with the unit that I have on the low end. On the high end, it's a step backwards, and that's more so dealing with the MLA technology itself. It's just a lot of, I guess, tinting artifacts that should not be there. I know on a lot of the 83s that I see, I know a lot of people think that there's this magenta band on the far right side or the far left side, just depending on how the actual module was cut and how it's assembled. But in reality, it's not really that far right or left side is magenta. It's what's going right beside it. That's really the problem. There's this blob that is deficient in red that causes your brain to think that the far right side is either tinted to red or not. So it's just one of those manufacturing defects that has cropped up with the MLA technology, with the 83-inch models. Yes, it can show itself in regular content. I've seen it sometimes, but for the vast majority of content, you will never know it's there. It's just one of those things. And on mine, it actually that difference between that deficient in red and the actual perception of being too reddish magenta on the far right has actually diminished somewhat as I've achieved over 300 hours of use. So the behavior of the display is not the same as prior year models, as far as tinting is concerned either. It's just different, very different for me.
Yeah, I'd say so overall with the G3, um, its brightness and HDR performance and all that, yeah, that was never really an issue for me.
Mm.
What it was all of the near black issues, the posterization,
Prominence
game mode.
overshoot.
Yeah, that game mode not being the same as out of game mode, and I don't agree with the filmmaker workaround really, at least not for all games. And so there was a lot of just things like that added up with the G3, and the color shift across the panel was, I think, pretty darn bad and noticeable, at least on the ones that I've had. And so with the G4, I've seen, a lot of comments, oh, they didn't make it any brighter, so it's not any better. And like if you go to ratings or whatever, where it's just all numbers based, it looks like so there's not really any change. And for me, I think the G4 is a substantially better TV than the G3, because if they didn't outright fix the issue, a particular issue of the G3, they at least addressed it somewhat. And across the
Yeah.
board, it's like every single thing that was complaining about with the G3 has been touched in some way. And now near black issues are almost gone. Like I said, in HDR10, you can have some posterization in certain areas, whereas in Dolby, you don't. So it's not that big an issue. Uniformity when it comes to color shifting across the screen, again, still there, but I definitely think it's better, at least better than the G3s that I personally had.
Mhm.
And it is brighter. It's not much brighter, but it is brighter. The tone mapping differences is also helping it to appear brighter. But like, I don't really care about the highest level of HDR performance, because that's a handful of content, throughout the
Correct.
history of movies and TV shows. Um, sure, it's nice if you're watching something that just came out and it is able to take advantage. But again, if you had, let's say, even going back to the G2, which is 1,000 nits, if you have an S90C, which is around 1,000 nits, if you have
Mhm.
a basically any of the 1,000 nit or higher OLEDs in different rooms, and you're watching the same show, you just go room to room to room. Like for the most part, if it's a high HDR graded show, they're close enough that there's not that much of a difference. Like, and that's rare content to begin with. So for
Right.
me, it's always, what is the distraction that this TV has that's going to take me out of the experience? So on the Sony, with the near black issues, the general usability of switching HDMI ports sometimes, or the like with the Sony, when you use even the Sony receiver, where all my devices were going to one port, it would list all those devices, but a lot of times it would just forget what they were, and they would all say like the same HDMI thing, and you didn't know what you were switching to, like things like that. Just usability, livability bugs that, again, why a long-term review after living with it is important. With Samsung, there's not really a lot of issues for me. Like I said, the motion, getting these occasional frame drop skips that I notice, that builds up over time. But really, the G3 had too many distractions and issues The G4 for me really doesn't. Again, it's not perfect. There are some things that I see every now and then, but on average, it's pretty good. And then being that it's the level of performance that it is at 83, it was a no-brainer. But for 65 to 77, I think it's just now an extra option. There's a lot of options in the 55 to 77 range now if you're looking for a real premium TV.
Yeah.
And last year
Yes.
I would not have put G3 in that discussion.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I agree with a lot of your points. Some things that I will say is um, the usability issues with the Sony. I don't have them simply because I learned years ago not to trust or use HDMI CEC.
Mhm.
So I don't have those issues. I do know that outside of that, yeah, the usability of the software itself in relation to the Pentonic chipset is a huge problem for me. To the fact that that's one of the things that I'm most disgruntled over is that actual implementation. When it comes to the G4 overall, um, it is definitely better for me than the G3, simply because, as you said, it's basically a bug fix of the G3. The brightness difference, yes, it's measurable, but is it visibly different? Not really. No, basically, absolutely not. But what I think the G4 is more so when it comes to 55 through 677, a G3A than a G4 in that
Mhm.
sense.
Yeah, it's what the G3 should
And
have been.
right, it should be right. It should have been what the G3 should have been. Absolutely. So chrominance overshoot, that was the biggest annoyance for me with the G3 series, and it didn't matter what size it was. It could have been the MLAs or the non-MLAs. It was just terrible. Um, the uniformity or even the brightness difference, just the light output difference between my G2 and 83 inch and the G3 I used to have 83 inch. The 83 G3 was dimmer, and it looks like it was intentionally dimmer than the G2 for some reason. So I am happy with the 83 inch model. I think that is what they've incorporated with MLA into the 83 inch size was definitely needed. I am super excited that they significantly reduced the overshoot. Yes, it's still there. Yes, I can see it in certain pieces of content where it should not be, but the count of the content where it's present has significantly dropped. So I am. It's basically I would call it, a step ahead of what the G2 is doing, whereas the G3 in relation to the G2 was like 5 steps behind what the G2 was doing on the overshoot side of the house. The posterization, again, we both hit on that. The low end posterization on the G3, it varied from unit to unit, but it was not there whatsoever on the G2's unit to units that I've seen. And so far, with the G4s that I've calibrated, every now and then I may see something, but it's not like it's obvious and like, yep, it's there on one piece to the next piece to the next piece to the next piece of content that I use for evaluation. It's just not there on the G4. So, I agree with you on that. Overall, the G4 is really what the G3 should have been. When it comes to the comparison between it and, the Samsung and the Sonys, it's right there with it. But for me, the QD OLEDs still take the lead, especially if you calibrate them properly. It's just a better product outside of the usability issues of the Sony. There is no excuse for Sony with that at this point. That's all of them in their implementation of the Pentonic. And yes, I think I probably was the first one, if you remember back when last year at the shootout, me saying that this thing should have never came out because of the actual usability problems that we experienced there. It was like it was rushed. For me, I wish they would have just scrapped last year and spent time perfecting that integration of that Pentonic chipset with their actual software and made the A95L Bravia 10 for this year. That's for me what they should have done. So for me, it's looking at this here and just comparing things here. Everything is quite close, which is going to make the official shootout even more interesting when we get there and actually put these things up against the others for everyone else to see. It's going to be a very tight race this year.
Yeah, and it's like, regardless of the outcome of the shootout, I don't know if you or anyone else here watches Doug DeMuro for car reviews. So, you know, at the end, he has his score where he breaks it down into a weekend category and, you know, the daily category.
Yes.
I see TVs in a similar way where the panel and its performance is like the weekend category.
And daily is
and then
the usability.
TV, like the actual TV.
Yeah.
What features does it have? Does everything work? Even the audio, like for the people who care about that stuff. I feel like the G4 would
day to day,
the highest in the day-to-day use category.
Yes.
Whereas a QD OLED, because of the panel difference, it would win in the weekend category. And it's like, this is where if next year or year after or whatever, if LG, some things may be in the works for a different panel, and if that happens, can't say too much, but like then things can change. But then also with a new panel, that can affect the usability and the TV aspect of it.
Correct. So here's my question for you, and because I agree with you, in the day-to-day usage, definitely the A95L is a step behind the LG because of the software issues with the Pentonic chipset. But if Sony were to correct those issues, would the Sony now become a day-to-day driver?
At the same size. Yeah. That's the thing. Like, again, for like we started earlier, the T-Con issue, does it turn on? Does it turn on is not a question you should ask yourself. Am I going to come home tonight and be able to watch TV?
So I agree with you on that. So
it's
so
like
Sony, I know you're watching Sony. You got to fix your usability quickly.
Yeah,
you only have a couple of months before the shootout. I can tell you that much.
Yep, and that the near black in HDR and Dolby Vision, you know, that's still something that sticks out for me. Like that should not be on a flagship. You know, just things like that. That's not every scene, obviously. That's certain content that's going to show that. But it's still like that's a distraction.
But I don't really point the finger at Sony for that. Because I know the interaction and what they got to deal with, because LG does the same thing, and it's just LG has priority when it comes to these bug fixes, but Dolby is really slow at resolving problems with their implementation on TVs, consumer TVs. It's just one of those things.
Well, I'm talking about the low end grayscale issue where it goes from green to positive green to positive red on the grayscale, and it's too low for the controls to fix, because that's an HDR10 too. And even if it's a disc, not low bit rate, like low bit rate, it amplifies the issue. You see it more, but on a disc or whatever, you can still see it in certain situations.
That's factory calibration.
Yeah, that's something that I want to. Every single A95L that I've seen, which is in the multiple dozens, has had that issue. It's measurable. That's something I want them to fix. Whether they can or not, we'll see, because that would affect any TV that's been calibrated in some way, probably.
Well, that's because that's factory calibration. I doubt you would see a firmware fix to correct that. That's more so what you do in the field. That's why I say when it comes to calibrating the Sonys, especially for HDR, the 2-point is not going to cut it because of what goes on in the low end.
Yeah, no, I'm saying even with 20-point though, it's when you get below like half a nit, like when you're measuring 1, 2, 3, 4, 5%, like you can see a positive green to positive red shift. Even the Samsung does it as well, but not as much.
They all do it.
Yeah, it's a QD OLED thing, and then also the low luminance under saturation on the Sony. Like there's things like that they can work on, that hopefully on the replacement model, they iron those out. If they iron that stuff out and they fix these, Pentonic MediaTek bugs, and they fix whatever this T-Con failure issue is, and then like that could be the greatest TV of all time, essentially.
Right. Right, but again, when it comes to the grayscale tracking on the low end, because I know exactly what you're talking about, that's a factory calibration and it will vary from unit to unit. You can in the field correct it if you use the right controls to do it. I can talk to you offline about that, but that's something that's correctable. So I see that with the LGs, with the G4s that I've measured. Some on that low end, they go green. Some are basically damn near
I've seen
perfect.
a blue
Others
drop.
are blue. Some
Yeah,
are red.
there's a blue drop in the like 20-ish, like 10 to 25
Yeah, that's
something
on all of
range.
them. Yeah,
Yeah, I've
no,
seen that. Like last year, it was more of a blue and red, so then you had green skin tones, which was an issue. This year, it seems the red and green hold, but it's just the blue drops a little.
yeah, but I'm speaking specifically in between
Yeah, at the very, very
0.5,
bottom. Yeah.
0.5 stimuli and 5% stimuli. That's where the variance is going to be greatest between these consumer displays, and that's regardless of actual manufacturer. That's just something that cannot really be corrected on the factory floor without giving more time and dedication to the factory calibration.
Yeah.
So
And there's also a lot of fluctuation in that range during not just the first 300 hours, but even later. You can come back 1,000 hours later and see it's different.
Yeah, and dude, that's one of the things that when it comes to the LGs that I can see clearly. Like one of the things this is one of the takes that I've seen since the G3 series, and it's probably existed prior to the G3s. I just haven't really paid attention to it. But G3, G4, after every comp cycle, you can and you will measure a different gamma value or luminance value on the very low end of the actual luminance range. If you calibrate it to be perfectly flat, run it for 4 hours, turn it off, let it run a comp cycle, turn it back on, let it warm up, whatever you want to do, and remeasure it. It's either going to have a higher luminance or it's going to have a lower luminance. For that comp cycle, then run it for another 4 hours again and measure it again, and it goes back to what it was two comp cycles before. That's one thing that I've seen with the LGs that is one of those like hair pull out moments. Another thing is there is a luminance shift that can and will happen when you hit 300 hours. Usually it's not a grayscale, it's not a calibration change. It's just the brightness shift happens where, say, for instance, you calibrate at a 2.4 gamma prior to 300 hours, you will now see something that at 300 hours will measure like 235, 232 or something. It's just a luminance change. It gets a little bit brighter. So stability is one of the items that I'm doing long-term testing on. I'm questioning whether or not it's going to fluctuate again in subsequent, hundreds of hours. So yeah, but yeah, I mean, all displays have their quirks. All displays have their quirks. I'm not, I can't really call it anything significantly bad with the G4. Again, it's a marked improvement for me over the G3.
It's all little things on pretty much most of the TVs now. Like the heat. The G4 is freaking hot. Like I have S95D, A95L, and G4. I can put my arm up to the A95L when it's running high APL content, and it's not bad. I can put it up to the Samsung, feel nothing. I put it up to the G4, and I have to pull it away, or I'm going to burn my arm. Like it's hot. This room with all three going got up to 93 degrees the other day, and I'm like, I got to stop.
Yeah, that's MLA technology for you right there. So that existed with the G3s. So yeah, it's one of those.
And there's the additional power draw this year, the 100 and however many watts that they added. Like that's got to go somewhere. Yeah, and something with all these like high-end displays, what I've noticed too is like it doesn't matter how perfect you calibrate it. If you're watching something that goes from a very high APL scene and the TV's nice and hot and warm, and then immediately switches to a very dark scene, like that luminance in that dark scene is now going to be raised a little bit from image retention or just heat.
Correct.
So like there's a lot of little things like that that you can't worry too much about because there's nothing you can do about it.
Correct. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Every time I go from HDR viewing to SDR viewing, I know if I were to put my meter on and measure it, it's going to measure brighter basically because it was in HDR mode. But as soon as I let the panel cool off, it could take 20, 30 minutes or whatever, upwards to an hour, remeasure it, it's back to normal. So yeah, just keep that in mind for end users. Using HDR, and this is for any of the displays that do HDR. Switching back to SDR, it's probably going to be a little brighter than what it was before going in HDR mode, and that's normal. It's just that it has to dissipate all of that heat created from HDR usage.
All right, the Bathman, thank you. Can I talk a little about game mode calibration? Comes out at 0 temp factory setting. Are you calibrating Dolby Vision on PCs? All right, so actually I can answer this pretty easily.
Yep.
One, LG quit using color temp 0 in game mode. Like Sony, this is where I give them the biggest praise. Their game mode, you don't have to touch anything. Like they just have accurate settings out of the box with game mode. Samsung and LG both, you have to make changes. LG, the only two things you really have to change is change to HDIG and change color temp. But still, there should at least be 2 game modes then, an accurate one and a whatever one.
No, I don't want no. Let's not do multiple game modes. Let's just have them make it, because they should make it accurate, just as accurate as the actual like filmmaker or your ISF modes.
Or they have those profiles in the game mode, like game optimizer, like make one of those accurate.
Yeah. Call it game reference.
Yeah. And as far as calibrating Dolby Vision on PCs or using game mode, so the Dolby Vision on PC thing, one in game mode, out of the box, like the Dolby Vision game is going to be the same as Cinema Home where it overtracks. And 2, with Dolby Vision on PC, I still have more testing to do with this, and one of the main focuses I will have is like PC guides for each TV that I get. But if you connect it as HDR10, Windows reads it as 1480 nits. If you connect it as Dolby, it's reading as 1370 because the way Dolby works and it moves in jumps. So it's just the way the EDIT is on it. Whether or not that makes a difference in actual performance, I still need to test and compare, but it would have to be after calibration and see if you can even fix the overtracking with after calibration on the G4. I haven't tried that yet.
When it comes to Dolby gaming, most of the Dolby processing is handled inside of the console or PC. I should say PC, right?
Yeah. So the Dolby for PC is a very new thing. Generally, it was the Xbox before.
So with the Xbox, all of the Dolby processing is handled inside.
It's low latency, player-led Dolby, essentially. And this is where, there's a thing that I've been on AVS.
They're trying to compensate for that.
Yes, because the luminance different, but they're also way overshoot. Like clearly, you can visually see it's overshot. Like,
of course. Yeah, so that's again where the calibration comes into play. So I get it. I know why they do it. But yeah, can they do it better? Sure, absolutely. Do I recommend Dolby gaming over HDR10?
Yeah, no. Again, it goes back to the implementation. The same thing with HDR10 Plus. If they could implement it right, it could be beneficial in getting rid of HDR sliders in games because it would just know what it should be.
Exactly.
But we're not there.
The implementation is the biggest problem and the factor. Yeah, as of now, no.
Yeah. All right, and Rafa, thank you. Is it worth a change from G2 to G4? Panel still has problems like the G2 with pink tint. So MLA, I don't know if you're going up in size, then definitely you can. It's worth doing it. Same size, there are improvements for sure. It's definitely a better TV. The pink tints was more of a thing, more visible before MLA. MLA now makes it where like it's still there, but like you were saying, it's more of like a cyan to pink to cyan to pink, depending on where on the screen, but it's not nearly as bad as it was before.
Yep. My take on this actual question here is it worth the upgrade from G2 to G4? Yes. And that's going to be regardless of size for me. The two things, well, the three things, oh no, the two things that you're going to see going from a G2 to a G4 is going to be the luminance of the actual HDR image itself. I'm speaking of not just white, but I'm speaking of all the colors themselves. That's one of the huge things that you're going to see, depending on well, it doesn't really matter on the actual content. In all honesty, the color brightness you're going to immediately see regardless of content that you're watching. That's one of the stark differences that I can easily, recreate regardless of the content itself. But when you feed the G4 the right content, it is a night and day difference in the actual image itself. The processing, as far as your SDR content, for me, it is improved compared to the G2. The uniformity on the 83s, again, is improved on the low end compared to the G2. The kind of step back, of course, is going to be at the full screen white, where the G2 is cleaner for me with the unit that I have compared to the 83 G4 that I have. But overall, panel to panel, size to size, is it an upgrade from a G2? Yeah. Is it an upgrade from the G3? If you're annoyed by the low end stuff, which is the overshoot, the pasteurization and stuff like that, yes, also. Mm-hmm. But I think absolutely for a G2 owner to upgrade to a G4, is it worth it? Yes. If you have the money for it, yes, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, it's like for me with the 55 to 77, obviously it's still better TV, but when it comes to the word worth, I think that's subjective person to person.
Yeah.
And there's a probability of something next year that could provide a bigger jump. That's the only reason I would say like G2 is still a good TV if you could hold out a year.
Yeah.
But if you want something solid that doesn't really have too much wrong with it and is a nice jump, then yeah, go for the G4.
Yeah, when it comes to year-over-year comparisons and things like that, I really do wish the manufacturers will stop this year-over-year jumps like they've been doing lately, and do it every 2 years so that people can get true value out of their purchases. Because for the majority of people buying these TVs, it's difficult, especially in this world economy, to constantly question your purchase and say, okay, if I get this now, am I going to have FOMO next year, or, anything else in regards to this? Just switch up to a 2-year cycle. I mean, it just helps the consumers long run. And I know, this is going to fall on deaf ears, of course, but, from being a consumer advocate, it's not wise or productive to really swap out your panels or TVs in your home year over year, unless, you have the funding for it, of course, or you do something like myself or you, where we do evaluation of these displays. Outside of that, it's just not productive at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want TVs themselves to become, the commodity, almost like basically cell phones, where you got to upgrade every year. No, we're not doing that with TVs.
Yeah, I mean, and just like the planned obsolescence is definitely a thing, but I'm saying like the what you can expect for a TV to last without degrading now is so much shorter than it used to be.
Correct, and that's
trying to force it.
Yes, that's where I have the problem. How will the Bravia 9 compare to A95L and G4? It's an LCD versus an OLED. That's exactly what it is. There's no difference.
There's a reason we're separating them in the shootout. I mean, yes, let's say the XR90 wins the LCD, and let's assume one of those wins the OLED. They'll be compared afterwards, but it's like LCDs just in a reference environment is not going to beat an OLED.
Ever. And the Bravia 9 is included in that statement.
That's not to say the Bravia 9 is a bad TV. No one's saying that.
Right. We're not saying that at all. The Bravia 9 is an excellent LCD, but it is an LCD, and you cannot bypass that. It's a great display. You will see blooming, depending on where you are, what you're showing, and how you look at the screen. The blooming is still there. So for those who think that the blooming has been eliminated, it's there.
Yep. All right. I don't see any more questions. I think we pretty much covered just about everything on the G4. So. Yeah, like I said, we're gonna be watching them every day that we watch TV, essentially for a while. So that anything pops up, updates change things, whatever. There will be updates going forward on how it's doing. But as far as the flagship level TVs for the year, they're all great. Sony has some usability issues that that for me holds them down. But aside from that, they all have a place. And it's not a simple, there is a best TV. There never is.
No, it's not. And for me, the G4 is a thumbs up TV. As I said, it has its quirks. It has its personality for calibration. It has its out of the box performance personality. Just like any other display, I'm just not as dissatisfied as prior years with LG's products as I am this year. Like, my satisfaction rate has gone up with the G4.
All right, and last one real quick. So the way that Sony sources panels in the past up to now, 65, 75 have been from CSOT, which is TCL, 85 from AUO. They're all VA panels, but there's a stark difference in how they perform. I personally expect that to continue to be the case. I don't see that changing. And I honestly would wish if they could just go all sizes ADS Pro panels and then get rid of that wide angle filter and the rainbow filter and all that. That's me personally, but there are other TVs that are using that, and for me, those are the most OLED-like because there's nothing on the screen and they're glossy. And so in the right content, they can have that closer to OLED look than a VA panel with all these filters applied to the screen.
Yep, and the right lighting environment in your room. That's also a huge factor with what I've been seeing here. So, don't expect that to change. It's going to be the same this year.
So it's like Sony might have the best backlighting control of any company with the XR90, but if they source panels that have issues that you don't like, doesn't matter how good that backlight is when they're at the mercy of the quality of the panel that they're getting.
Same thing with their use of WRGB OLED and QD OLED. Same exact thing.
So, all right. Well, thanks for coming on. If you want to close out with anything, any tours coming up, things like that, how to get a hold of you?
Anyone who's interested in calibration, you can reach out to me at info@av-fi.com. I will be in the Northeast corridor next week, basically in between Wednesday and Friday. After that, I'll be touring Florida. I think it's scheduled for the following weekend, the 20th, weekend of the 20th, which is next week, right? Am I correct? So Northeast, I'll be from Wednesday through Friday, then from basically Friday through Monday in Florida. I also have calibrations coming up in the Bay Area of California, LA, and San Diego right before Memorial Weekend. So if you're interested in calibration, please reach out to me, info@av-fi.com.
All right. got a last second here. So he has a clarification, G265 at a return 4 of them for pink line on the sides. Again, the pink,
The G4 has it too.
just less.
Yeah, just less. The G4, the G3,
on average. We'll say on
it.
average. There's always going to be a bad panel. But
Right.
on average, you can expect less.
Yes.
And then Ephraim, Tennessee. Can do Tennessee. You know, you can email me. Email
it depends on. Yeah, for me, it depends on what portion of Tennessee. Like, I'm based in South Carolina, so getting from South Carolina to Nashville is easy. But going to Memphis, yeah, we're gonna have to conversate about that one.
Okay. Yeah, so I am pretty much booked for May. I might be able to fit one more in the Miami area on Sunday the 26th. Aside from that, I will be booking June trips in a couple weeks. So it doesn't really matter where you are. You know, you can email me, and if I don't go where you are, I can refer you to someone who is there. My
Same for
email
me.
is at the top of above me. You can see the email up there, calibrations@gmail.com. And I want to thank everybody for coming and watching. We did go a little bit longer than I expected, but you know, I think we got a lot of coverage done. Yeah, and I just personal life, day job changing again. So YouTube is really shrinking in how much time I can put into it. So discussion streams like this on certain models will probably be the way going forward for me. Because if I were to do a review, not only am I living with it for a long time, it's dozens and dozens of hours of recording content, editing, and all of that. So this just is this was an overview, not really a review.
Right, overview of the G4.
Yeah,
Let's
of
do
how it is today. You know, this could change in a month.
Let's do an overview of the A95L next.
Okay. Well, that's at the point, I think, 7 months in, that's where it's like, that's the TV. Like, I've tried giving them a long time for some updates, and whether it's
Sony,
Dolby or Sony or whatever, like Sony has a history of taking a long time to do updates.
Correct. They test the hell out of their actual updates. For me, when it comes to updates, I'm one of those individuals where I'm not a fan of doing firmware updates, excessive firmware updates, unless it's adding a feature or fixing something that I know that I want them to correct. Outside of that, I don't see the point of doing firmware updates. And if you have constant firmware updates with just randomized, words like minor bug changes here and there, that means to me that you have some improvement in quality control that you need to work out before you release a product.
Yep. My philosophy is, if you're happy with your device, whether it's a TV, a Blu-ray player, a whatever, leave it offline and only update if there's an update that comes out that has something you want.
Correct.
That's my opinion now. They all can mess up at some point.
Absolutely.
All right. And then, so if we do another one of these, I'm actually going to suggest we do the S95D, which kind of brings this in, because there's been a lot of discoveries in the service menu on Samsung lately. So let's get testing and see what we think, and we can come back and talk about that stuff.
Yeah. So they finally figured that part out. Okay. The pros and the cons.
There's a lot of there's been a lot of things coming out about service menu on Samsung, and like even toning down the active tone mapping and things like that. So a lot of things to toy with. Again, my number one TV recommendation still to this day, S89C. Go in the service menu, change the name to S95C. Like, if you want the best value bang for the buck, you cannot beat that.
Best bang for the buck for me depends. I mean, it varies. I like LG and Sony. So
again, if there's something that you particularly want from another brand, or something you don't like about a brand, then obviously that defeats that. But for the average person, the S89C 77-inch at $1,800 or less, like that's
for me when it comes to Samsungs, it's that usability type thing with their operating system that I
set it up to ignore it and just go straight to HDMI, and I don't have any issues.
That's the thing for me. It's like it's one of those things, like, it reminds me of the A95L and the implementation of the Pentonic chipset. It's that annoying to me. So when something annoys me, I can't deal with it.
So, all right. And Mozart, yes, if you have a Panasonic UB or 9000 or 820, do not update to the latest update if you have not yet.
Yeah. Luckily, I don't own Panasonic Blu-ray players, so I don't have to worry about that.
All right. Yeah, definitely have to get ready for work.
All right.
Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you again some point soon.
All right.